Good morning. I'm Rammurti. If any of you don't know who I am, this is my wife Sita. We're your ministers this morning. In the summer of 1976, up in the foothills area where Ananda Village is located, they were in the fourth year of a very severe drought. There had been almost no rain for that time. And there were fires everywhere in the foothills. And this was one time that Ananda Village did not escape that threatening concern that we have here in California. And the fire swept through the community. It burned down 22 homes. It burnt or scorched 800 acres of woodland and left it a very different place than it had been before the fire. The response of the people there was quite different from person to person. One of the great lines from that time period of Ananda occurred when Devi and Jyotish, who are now the spiritual directors of Ananda worldwide, Devi was sitting with her few days old baby down at what's now called downtown Ananda, where the market is, an area that had not been threatened by the fire. She was sitting there when Jyotish and others who had been up fighting the fire and then trying to rescue a few things from the homes once they saw they couldn't be saved, when they came down. And she looked up at Jyotish with concern and said, "How's the house?" And he turned and said, "It doesn't have any leaks anymore." But there were others who didn't have quite that light a response to the fire. It was a time of cleansing, really, and many people left. People who had been there primarily for outward. Are we not getting me? But in that time, shortly after that time, there was, of course, an investigation as to why that particular fire had occurred. And it was discovered that it was the fault of the county because there had been a faulty spark arrestor on a tractor that a county worker was driving. And so as a result, there was great joy that went up and down the ridge where Ananda Village is located, and many other people were there. Aha, we can sue the county and we can rebuild. But Swami wrote a letter to the Board of Supervisors and posted it downtown Ananda. And the gist of it was, we do not want to have our misfortune, our karma, taken out on all of our neighbors and the residents of Nevada County. No, we'll take responsibility for this ourselves. It was his conviction that the community's karma should be embraced and dealt with rather than trying to pass it off to someone else. And he stuck with that conviction. I've heard Ananta say, Gary's brother here, and a man who's head gardener once again there, I've heard him say that when he saw that letter posted there, he could just feel joy flood his body because he was of similar conviction and felt this is the right thing to do. But many there didn't feel that way, and within a year, a lot of the people that had been part of the community were gone. This was Swami just not batting an eyelash, but holding to his convictions. And I guess you could say that that brought victory as we see Ananda spread all the way around the world with tens of thousands of people involved. If we were to polled Christian congregations around the country this morning and asked them to describe the personality traits of Jesus, I would guess that among the leading adjectives they might use would be that he is forgiving, that he's loving, that he's gentle. And of course, Jesus is all of that. This is truly who he is. But there's another side of Jesus' personality that we hear about in this morning's reading. And that was that he could be very demanding. As I saw what scriptures I had to deal with this morning, it became clearer to me why neither Asha nor Shanti are here this weekend. Well, this is not the basic joy-filled, isn't it, wonderful, the spiritual path kind of reading. But he's brutally direct here, straightforward, and says, okay, this is the way the spiritual life really is. Do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. What a shocking statement. What a thing for him to say. Why would he say such a thing? And what are the circumstances in which this occurred? Well, Jesus at this time it's still fairly early in his ministry. It's in what's called the Galilean period. Galilee is his home. His hometown was Nazareth, where he grew up. And at this time, he's still preaching in that area. He hasn't gone out abroad much. And just prior to this passage, Jesus was teaching not far from Nazareth, and he had just finished selecting his disciples. He finally had picked all 12 of them. And at this time, he was still getting harassed a lot by the Pharisees. I shouldn't say at this time, that happened throughout his whole life until the Pharisees turned him over to the Romans, who then took his life. But he had just gathered his disciples together, and they had gone to a home, whether it was just for retreat or rest, we don't know. But he had been teaching, and it seems like he probably was trying to get away from the crowds and have a little time. But instead of getting that, all the people followed him who wanted to hear his teachings, and they crowded into the house. The house was overflowing. And in this time period, in this setting, one of the things he does is lay down for his disciples primarily, I think, kind of the rules of the road. It's called the mission discourse. But in it, he told them what they needed to expect. And it's important to realize, and most of us don't, that the disciples, when Jesus chose them, were very young. If you take what you see in movies or in paintings, it looks like they were middle-aged. But the disciples were 15 to 20 years old when he chose them. The pattern at that time was that about 15, you begin to, the boys began to think about getting married. And by the time they were 20, almost everyone was married. And it may be that Matthew and Peter were a little older, because we know that Peter was married, and of course Matthew had an important position by then as a tax collector, for which he was much reviled. So here are these young guys, and they've been enamored and kind of beguiled by this radical rabbi who's saying all these things that many of which no one has ever heard before. But they're gung-ho, and they're here, and they're around him. And so Jesus is telling them, you can't carry anything. You can't take anything that would hold things. So no carrying bags. And you can only take the clothes that you have on. You can't take a change. And you cannot take any food with you. So no food stores. You have to wear rough sandals. They had shoes in those days that protected the feet and were more comfortable. None of that. He's telling them that they are going to live a life in which they have to be completely dependent upon the divine for sustenance. All of these restrictions and confinements might have dampened lesser souls. But these guys, who were really just a bunch of teenagers, embraced it and said, yes, we're going to do this. Well, they're here in this house and getting some of these instructions, and Jesus is teaching more. And it's a crowd, and here comes a cry from the outside. Hey, Jesus, guess who's out here? Your mom just showed up, and she got a bunch of your brothers with her. Well, for Jesus, this is the perfect opportunity, because now he has a chance to show his disciples and others who are interested in following him, again, just what this means. And so he looks at them, and it's great, this term, the familial warmth. The families in were very tight, very close. And Jesus knew, as some of the disciples may not have been clear yet, that he was going to be taking them away. And so he turned to the group in the house and said, who is my mother? Who are my brothers? And then waving his hands at the disciples and those around him, he said, behold, my brother, my sister, and my mother. And so even he, and we know that he loved family and he didn't want to destroy the family unit or anything, but even he was then disclaiming the importance of them. He went on to say that whoever does what God tells him to do, whoever does what God wants, those are the people that I want to consider my family. So Jesus and all masters came to perhaps disabuse us of some of the ideas we have about the spiritual path and what they've brought, that they did not come to bring peace throughout the earth. They did not come to bring peace between contentious groups. They came to help us have peace with God. They came to bring a harmony into our lives so that we are not warring with the divine. Jesus goes on later and says that he who loves his relatives more than they love the divine, he that puts his relatives, his worldly responsibilities, his mundane daily activities ahead of his love and his activities for God, is really not worthy of making the journey with him. So these demands that Jesus put on his disciples stood them in pretty good stead through their lives. They spent entire lifetimes, each of them, maybe other lifetimes too, but they spent that lifetime preaching and teaching and spreading Jesus' teachings really throughout the world. And he was speaking to them like this only to light a fire of divine courage in them. Some of them were new to the path. They had no idea what they were getting into, but Jesus knew. In fact, at one point Jesus says, he that findeth his life shall lose it, and he that loseth his life for my sake shall find it. And he was actually speaking very literally. Nobody else knew that, except Jesus, of course. But because by the time of the end of their lives, 10 of the 11 of the remaining disciples after the crucifixion had been martyred, and 6 of them had been crucified. So he was laying out what it was going to take to live a life of complete dedication to him. Now, in our world, it certainly seems very unlikely that any of us will be required to stand up for our convictions under such severe and even lethal circumstances as the disciples had to. But we do have the opportunity to follow this path courageously to victory. Let's take a look at at the way Swami titled this topic for today. Victory demands the courage of conviction. Well, what is our victory? For us, what is he referring to? Oh, really, victory is to gain soul liberation. That's it. To return to God, to fight the battles we need to fight, to merge back in to God again, to let Divine Mother finally, permanently wrap her arms around us and keep us. And what is conviction? Well, conviction is our belief, what we believe, that we are not separate from God, that God is the only reality, and that the goal of our lives is to live every day in accordance with that truth, that we are actually one with God. And courage, well, courage is the quality we have to have if we're going to live in line with our belief, with our convictions. It's interesting, there's many authors and teachers have put out this idea that courage is the one virtue that you absolutely have to have if you're going to practice any of the virtues. Because all of the virtues we can practice require courage to be able to do it, to live up to what we believe in. That takes courage. Now, this is not really because our lives are going to be in danger if we live those convictions. But we have to do battle with Maya in living our everyday lives here in Silicon Valley. How do we live? How do we make the myriad decisions that determine our lives on the basis of our convictions? What is really being talked about here, I think, is austerity, is tapasya, self-restraint. We have to demonstrate courage in self-control and self-restraint, and all the little things that we do in our lives, not only the big things, but in all of the little decisions, which is really what determines who we are. Think about Swami at that fire. That was not a big decision to him, to decide to turn away what might have become $1 million and allowed us to rebuild Ananda at that time. Sita and I came just about 9 or 10 months after the fire was over. And there was not much there. And if the money had flooded in from a court case, and people all up and down the ridge won and got money and were able to rebuild, it would have looked very differently, I imagine, when we were there. There was one house that had been rebuilt, and there were 2 under construction. And that was pretty much it. And slowly, of course, it came. But that was not a big deal for Swamiji, because it was just one more decision made in sequence of doing the right thing, of sticking true to his convictions. But for us, we have lots and lots of little decisions that make up who we are. What media do we let into our lives? Who do we spend time with? How do we respond in interactions with other people? How do we maintain our willingness level as we go day to day? Swami says that the stages on the spiritual journey constitute an endless series of little, separate, specific acts of will. I never read that until just recently. But what a powerful thing. I mean, it's something to use in steering your life and helping you understand how you can make spiritual progress. It's really the key. The stages on the spiritual journey constitute an endless series of little, separate, specific acts of will. And there's the path for us, if we can do that moment by moment. Master also said that the minutes are more important than the years. You notice he didn't say that the minutes are more important than the days, or the minutes are more important than the weeks even, but the minutes are more important than the years. And he encouraged us that as soon as the beginning of a thought comes that we know might take us, if we go with it, in a direction that we really don't want to go, to catch it right then, the seed of the thought. And that's when it's easy to control, because it gets big very, very quickly. When Sant Keshavadas, a well-known spiritual teacher from India who had a ministry in the United States for a while, renowned chanter, when he visited Ananda in the late 70s, he was given the grand tour, taken around and shown, and a lot had happened in the 2 or 3 years since the fire. And at the end of his tour, as he was visiting with Swami, he said, creating this community required a great deal of tapasya. And Swami quietly answered, yes, yes. So for him, as much as anything, it may have been that near decade that he had to spend on his own, without guru bhais, without peers, sticking true to Master and moving forward, doing everything he could to do Master's will. And then, having done that for 8-9 years, Ananda began. And then we can see what we have now, that the tapasya paid off. Some Christians believe that God demands suffering in exchange for blessings. But this is not true, Swamiji said, nor is it what Jesus taught. But it is the nature of things that to accomplish anything in this world, sacrifice is required. It's a spiritual law. We have to renounce the lesser desires, even in sometimes what feels like real needs, to be able to focus our intention and increase our magnetism to draw to us what we want. It may not even have to completely be done of free will and volition. I had a friend that I grew up with in the church. We attended the same church. We didn't live close together. And one of my favorite things to do, and his, was for us to go over to each other's houses after Sunday service and spend Sunday afternoon together, because we didn't get to see each other very much. And the only difficult part of that for me was that he was taking piano lessons, and he had to practice, no matter what, 1 hour a day, every day of the year. He had to do that. And so when I was over there visiting him on Sunday, he had to practice his 1 hour. And I don't know what it was like the other days of the week, but when I visited him on Sunday, the piano bench was moved over so he could sit right on the end of it in the middle of the piano. And his mother sat on the other half of the piano bench with a yardstick in her hand. 1 hour. Every Sunday afternoon that I visited his house, this is what I observed. And I tried to be good, because if he even turned his head in my direction, he'd get a whack. He was to be totally focused. Now, they say it takes about 10,000 hours to become a really excellent pianist. I don't really know if that's true. I definitely have not done it. But that's a lot of time. I didn't really add up the years, but I'll bet he got his 10,000 hours in. We went to a different church after a while, and so I didn't see him very much until we got to high school. together. He was 1 year ahead of me, and he was a junior when I went to the high school and was a sophomore. And he was the leading rock and roll pianist in the late 50s for our high school. I've never seen anyone, even a professional, do as good an imitation of Jerry Lee Lewis and the Great Balls of Fire as he did, where he ran his thumb all the way down the keys. Later, for about 2 or 3 years, we spent time traveling in a Southern Gospel quartet. And of course, he was the pianist. He became very, very good, if through demanding means of his mother. I don't think that was the kind of music his mother had in mind when she sat there all those hours. But nonetheless, he got very good. So Swami's telling us, if we want to accomplish things, we have to recognize the spiritual law that sacrifice must be made. When Yogananda was building his work in the 1920s, he had a lot of tapasya, which paid off for him later. We think about him zooming back and forth across the country from about 1923 into the early 30s, and perhaps we think, oh, that's great, you know. Maybe we even think that must have been fun. I don't know. But Master said, at least on one occasion, when someone asked him about the 4,000 or 5,000 people who had attended a big rally of his, you know, or commented to him that so many people must have come to God in that experience, he said, sadly shaking his head, no, not one will continue with this path. But he talked to anyone and everyone pretty much that would hear him. If you get the little daily posts of what Master did in his life in different years, you see he went to the Kiwanis Club, the Lions Club, the Odd Fellows, the Masons. In Minneapolis one time he even gave a talk to the Hoo Hoo Club. So I'm not sure what that is, but you know, he's scraping the bottom of the barrel probably in doing that. And that was the energy that was required from him, even if he didn't see results in the short time, to build his work. You know, only a handful of people who came to him in the 20s stayed with him. I was looking at that, and I think there were only about eight important to the work devotees that stayed with him for a decade of barnstorming across the country, and of course pouring his lifeblood into their spiritual development. And some of the people who left him really betrayed him and caused him a great deal of trouble. Swami, in building the work in India, was just amazing to watch what he would do, despite the fact that he was in very ill health. He just never, ever let that get in his way. He used great courage to muster his physical resources. We were going to, when I was living there working with him, we were going to a TV show that he had wanted to do. Everyone told him not to go. And I wasn't so sure why, but on the way, twice we had to stop the car so he could get out of the car and throw up. And then we went on to the studio and sat waiting for time for Swami to go in. And the entire time, his eyes were closed. And he was very, very focused. And I was sitting right next to him. For a period of that time we were waiting, which was quite a while, it was like a half an hour. He grabbed a hold of my leg, and he was just shaking like this. He was just quivering and shaking. The thought that came to me, of course, with a fundamentalist background of mine, I thought, he's fighting the devil. You know, he's not going to let anything keep him from going in and doing this television show. And he clearly was in struggle with something. Maybe it was just his horrible health. I don't know. But what courage he gave us as an example. And this wasn't particularly to do some great thing. He was just going on a short TV show to be able to spread the teachings. The heart of the story, of this particular truth, is that we need to be ever alert, ever vigilant, so that when our opportunities come to make decisions, we're using the courage we can muster to make the right turn. It may even be a very little thing, but if we can turn toward the light in that decision, if we can move Godward, then we can gain victory. In the end, we'll gain victory by using that courage. So may we all follow Masters and Swamiji's examples and be spiritual warriors in conquering our desires, our fears, our doubts, and return to Divine Mother.